I was doing an interview yesterday with Dylan Dreiling. He and his wife, they have a podcast called the Ananda Podcast. And we were, among many other things, we were talking about the situation of younger people who have small children and who are become more aware, perhaps even aware of the spiritual path, and they are trying to do everything right, do the best thing for their children, often homeschooling their children, trying to live in a more aware way. And after talking to him about this, I had a strong reaction because it put me back to when I had small children and I was in a spiritual movement and I was trying to do everything just right. And I realized I had almost forgotten this because it's so many years ago. I don't know if I had forgotten or suppressed, but it actually made me think about this, and I decided to do this video about it because it is actually one of the factors that can cause people to get disappointed with the spiritual path. So I thought it would fit in with this topic of avoiding disappointment. And just to give you a little bit of a background, the reason why this surprised me was that when I was in my second spiritual movement, I thought it was just us that were like this. I didn't realize that there were many other people who were in the same situation. And when I talked to Dylan about this, I realized that there are probably many, many people who have gone through the same thing that I went through, and maybe they could benefit from hearing my story about this. And so here I was in my mid-20s when I found the Ascended Master teachings. There was this particular organization called the Summit Lighthouse. And it was quite big at the time. It had tens of thousands of members. And this was in the mid-1980s. And so after some years, my first wife and I moved with our two young children, they were 6 and 9 at the time, to the United States to live by the headquarters of the Summit Lighthouse, which was in Montana. Or they had just moved it to Montana from California. And so here we come into this community. There were 600 people working for the Summit organization on staff. Some of them were children among the 600. And they had their own school, a Montessori school. And so there was a community there, but there were also people who had moved to Montana to be close to the headquarters, who lived in the outlying area. The organization had bought a ranch in Montana that became their headquarters. So it was quite a large community, and I was young, I was new to the community, so I did what most people did. I tried to fit in, do what was recommended, basically follow all the recommendations and all the rules for how you were supposed to live when you were a spiritual person in that particular movement. And it was very much focused on doing outer things and not doing outer things. In other words, doing the right things and not doing the wrong things. And there was quite elaborate rules and recommendations for this. First of all, there was, of course, the purely, what we might say, spiritual demands. And this is something that I'll talk about because it's part of the topic here. There was spiritual demands and there were practical, everyday demands on how to live. And so in the summit, the spiritual activities was, first of all, we gave these decrees, which is like a high-speed chanting, where you're invoking spiritual light from the Ascended Masters. And we would do this together in groups, and sometimes there could be a couple hundred people, sometimes 500, sometimes 700. And when they had conferences, which they had once a year, they had a summer conference where people would camp at this ranch, there could be 3,000 people doing these decrees together. And it was a powerful exercise. You really could feel there was a certain momentum there. But if you were on staff or one of the more dedicated people, you were supposed to ideally get up at 5 o'clock in the morning and do 2 hours of these decrees. And then you would work during the day, and if you had children, you would take care of your children, you get them up, get them breakfast, take them to school, and then you would work for 8 hours, and then you come home, take care of your children, get them dinner and talk to them, and then you were supposed to go to evening decrees and do another 2.5 hours. And then ideally, well, sometimes you wouldn't actually go to evening decrees because there would be a special service. And in the beginning, there was a main service on Saturday night, a Saint Germain service where you would decree for 4 hours. Then on Sunday, there would be a Sunday service that wasn't quite as focused on decrees, and it would be during the day. But then there would be a Friday night decree service, also for 4 hours. On Wednesday, there would be a healing service. And then at some point, they also started on Monday and Tuesday, they also had evening services. So you could theoretically go 5 nights a week, and then in the day, Sunday, if you were to do everything right. And then there were even certain decrees you were supposed to do on your own time. I don't know when anybody had their own time, but that was what you were supposed to do. So just the spiritual demands to do the spiritual activity would take up a lot of time, right? You can see that. So then if you had children, what time did you have to spend to your children other than the practical, feeding them and putting them to bed and this kind of thing? There wasn't much time. So, but then there were all these recommendations for how you're supposed to live. They were big on diet, for example, and at a certain point they started recommending this macrobiotic diet, which is very elaborate for how you prepare the food and cook the food. Personally, I could never get into it. I thought it was too much. But and then they had recommendations for, well, for example, certain colors were not considered to be of a higher vibration. They would tie you to the lower vibrations. So you weren't supposed to have a red car, wear orange clothes or red clothes or black clothes, and you were supposed to never lose your harmony, never get upset about anything. And, there were just so many of these rules. And when I talked to Dylan about this, I realized that this is the same in many other spiritual movements. Where, and you see, if you're a single person, whether you're young or old or retired, it may be possible to follow the rules. But if you've got children, especially small children, how are you going to do this? And what I realized was that the effect of all of this is that people become stressed. People literally become stressed. And I was stressed. And I can see now that all of the people around me, they were stressed too. Because everybody was trying to do the right thing and live up to all the demands. But it was just such a strain to do it that everybody was under stress. And when I think back at it, what I realize is that it's just a contradiction. I mean, it's enormously contradictory, because why was I attracted to the spiritual path? Because I couldn't see living the normal materialistic lifestyle. It just wasn't for me. I remember, and I've said this before, I had a newspaper route when I was in my early teens. I would walk around this nice upper middle class neighborhood, distribute newspapers every afternoon after school. And I could see that I could have the lifestyle that these people had. I could go to school, get a degree, and get a job. And I could buy a house like this, and I could raise my children. I could live there for 40 years until I retired. But I just knew this isn't enough for me. I can't live this way. So I became spiritual, and I moved to the United States to a spiritual community because I wanted to get away from all of these demands of this stressful lifestyle with a career demands and this and that. Yet the spiritual path became just as stressful to me as if I had had this career in business or wherever and trying to do everything there. So did that really make any sense? That I try to get away from the world, but this becomes another source of stress. And basically what I realized when I look back is that if you did everything that this spiritual movement, I won't say demanded, but recommended, it would be like putting on a straitjacket. I mean, you couldn't move. You couldn't have feelings. You couldn't think your own thoughts. You couldn't do your own thing. You never had any free time. Because you could always feel, and this is what I see when I see back, most people feel, we're not doing enough. It's not enough. There were always more demands. I mean, I remember, coming there with 2 children from Denmark and not really knowing what the community was like. And we got installed in this very old mobile home, probably from the 1950s, and because there was no other space for us. And I literally had to go out back behind this row of mobile homes, and I found an old mattress that had been sitting out there in the weather for several weeks, and I took that in. That's what we slept on for a year. And now we are in this new community. We want to do everything right. We're going to get up at 5 o'clock in the morning to do the decrees, and this wears you down very, very quickly. And then after we'd been there a few days, this neighbor who had been on staff for many years comes over and gives us a cassette tape with a rosary to Mother Mary that the leader of the organization had recommended that people with children should give that every night, on top of doing all these other things, right? The morning decrees, the evening decrees, taking care of your children, working. But you were supposed to read this rosary, which was 45 minutes. And I'm sure she had the best of intentions, and she probably wasn't even thinking. But I just looked at it and thought, how am I supposed to have time to do a 45-minute rosary on top of all these other things? I'm supposed to do this when I'm done with evening decrees at 9:30 in the evening. So I'm going to spend 45 minutes on this rosary and then I have to get up at 5. I mean, when am I going to sleep, So anyway, I'm just saying, the whole thing, if you wanted to do everything just right, it was an enormous strain. It was literally like putting on a straitjacket. And I saw people who had been doing this for years and trying, and most people, after some time, they found a personal balance. A lot of people, they didn't get up at 5 o'clock to do morning decrees when they had children because it was just too much. They got up in time to feed their children and get them to school and those kind of things. So people found a personal balance, but still, everybody was under stress, trying to live up to the demands. And I saw some people after some time, they couldn't do it anymore. And in fact, I also got to a point where I couldn't do it as much as I did in the beginning. And in the business world, you have this concept that people who get higher up in a business become executives. They get under such stress that they last maybe a few years, and then they have executive burnout. And what I realized is that many spiritual people, they have spiritual burnout. I mean, they're trying their best for a time to live up to all these demands, and then they come to a point where they just break under the strain. And oftentimes, they kind of flip from one extreme to the other because you have been living this unbalanced lifestyle for so long, trying to live up to all these demands. Now you can't do it anymore. So you have to let go of all the spiritual. Maybe you have to even abandon your spiritual movement or become critical of the guru and say the guru was misleading you and all of this stuff. And as I said, for years I thought maybe it was just our movement that was so extreme, but I'm realizing that there are certainly other spiritual movements where you have the same dynamic, that the demands are just too much, especially when you have children. And so what I was realizing as I was thinking about this, and which we also talked about in the interview, was that I think the main problem we're dealing with here is that it's kind of like we are being pulled in opposite directions. We are trying to sit between two chairs. Because for thousands of years, especially in the East, but even in the West as well, with the Catholic Church, we have had this idea that there is a clear difference this discrimination between spiritual activities and worldly activities. You look back in the East how they have this tradition of gurus. A guru creates an ashram set aside from the world, and the students or chelas come to the guru, they sit at the feet of the guru, they do whatever he demands, but they are separating themselves from the world. In the Buddhist tradition, you have these monasteries where monks and nuns withdraw from the world. They live a monastic lifestyle where they forsake worldly activities, including having children, and they're supposedly focusing on spiritual activities. And in the Catholic tradition, you also have the monasteries, monks and nuns withdraw to live a life of contemplation. And it's this mindset that if you are a spiritual person, you're supposed to be focused on spiritual activities. And so we have this idea that if we're really spiritual, we should spend most of our time and attention focused on spiritual activities. And these worldly demands, it's just something we have to do. And we have to just get it out of the way so we can focus on the spiritual. And when I look back, I can see it in myself, I can see it in many, many people I met. We had exactly that attitude. We need to do as little worldly activities as possible so we can focus on the spiritual. And, you know, you can look at it in various ways. And one way that I've described it so far is simply the practical way. That when you have this contradiction, because it is a contradiction for most of us, between spiritual activities and worldly activities, it puts you under strain. It puts you under stress because you are pulled in two different directions. Most people can't survive physically from doing spiritual activities. Now, in the Summit Lighthouse, there was, as I said, several hundred adult people that were on staff working for the church. And so they had done this because they wanted to focus on a spiritual activity. But the church had just moved its headquarters to Montana, and they were building a community there. So most people were doing very hard physical work for many hours a day, often more than 8 hours. So they were doing the same as if they had a job. They were just living in a place that was supposedly a spiritual place. So it wasn't really spiritual activities they were focused on. It was very much practical physical activities. So, you know, and I think the whole problem here is we have this discrimination between worldly and spiritual. And we think if we are spiritual people, if we found the spiritual path, we should focus most of our attention on spiritual activities and as much as possible avoid worldly activities. And as I said, if you're single, if you're retired, maybe you can do that to some degree. But if you have children, especially when they're small children, how are you going to do this? I mean, you're literally stressing yourself out. You are having burnout. And why would you want to put yourself through this? I mean, I look back at it and I ask myself, why did I put myself through this? And it was precisely this dynamic. I thought, here I am, all of my life I've been longing to find the spiritual path. Now I found this high spiritual teaching with ascended masters. They have all of these decrees we can do to balance your karma and balance world karma and help the world move forward. I've got to do this. But at the same time, there was children, there was making a living, which wasn't very easy in Montana, where the average wage was $6 an hour. And so it got to a point where I look back at it and I say, I should never have done this. I should never have been so obsessive, compulsive about doing all these spiritual things. I should have found a more balanced approach to it. And when I say this, it's sort of a difficult thing because, I realize and I have accepted that everything we do is a result of our personal psychology. So I look back and I say, I should have found a more balanced approach. But on the other hand, I also realized that given how my psychology was at the time, I couldn't have found a more balanced approach. I was who I was, and I had to act out what I did in order to act it out in such an extreme way that I came to the point where I could see it was too much. It was the only way I could have done it, given my psychology. But that doesn't mean that everybody else has to do the same thing. Perhaps you can look at this and say, well, do I have to act it out in such an extreme way? Or can I find a way to just look at my psychology and overcome this imbalance? And I probably could have done it if I had had the right guidance. I probably could have done it. But I didn't have that guidance because the culture in the movement was, you're supposed to do all of this spiritual stuff. And that's what I'm trying to say. If you can see for yourself that you are involved with a spiritual movement, or you have been, where they have the same kind of dynamic, you're supposed to do all these things, perhaps you could benefit from stepping back. And what I'm saying is, it starts with considering this animosity almost between spiritual and worldly activities. Why do we have to have that? Just think about this. Why do we have to have it? And what I have realized is that we are living in a different time now. I think probably most spiritual people have heard of this concept that there are spiritual ages or cycles. There was the Age of Pisces, the last 2,000 years, and now we are moving into the Age of Aquarius. And each age has a certain dynamic. And I think in the Age of Pisces, it was not necessarily unreasonable that some people withdrew from the world to live in a more spiritual, you might say, environment, even though I don't really know how living in a Buddhist monastery or a Catholic monastery is necessarily spiritual if they are just focused on outer things. But anyway, so maybe that was okay in the Age of Pisces. But in the Age of Aquarius, this is no longer the ideal. Because, you can look at there's a certain progression on the planet. So there was a time when very, very few people were open to a spiritual path, to the spiritual side to life. And that number has grown throughout the Age of Pisces. So we now look at the world and we see that many, many more people. I can even see when I found the spiritual path, that was 1976. Very few people were open to the spiritual path. But now, many, many more people. I mean, when I, for example, in the 70s and 80s, if you went into a spiritual bookstore or a regular bookstore, they would have very few spiritual books. Today, you have many bookstores have many more spiritual books, and there are even spiritual bookstores that only sell spiritual books. So you can see that there's many, many more people that have become interested in the spiritual side to life. And in this age, we're moving into the Age of Aquarius. The challenge is that we overcome this separation between spiritual and worldly activities, and we integrate spirituality in our everyday lives, so that we see that everyday activities are part of our spiritual lifestyle, our spiritual approach to life. So we're not seeking to withdraw from the world. We're not seeking to withdraw from having a job, having a career, having a fulfilling job, a creative job, a job where we can make a difference in improving society, some aspect of society. We're not seeking to withdraw from having children, because all of this is part of our spiritual path. And it's part of our approach to spirituality. And, I can look back and I wish I had had more balance 40 years ago. But again, you can say, I have learned to say over the years, well, I was who I was at the time. I had the psychology I had at the time. I did the best I could. I couldn't do anything else. But as I said, does that mean that everyone who finds the spiritual path has to go through that same process of becoming so extreme that you burn out in order to find balance? Or can other people perhaps learn from my example and say, okay, let me see, what is my personal balance here? And I really think that everybody who's a spiritual person can benefit from considering this, overcoming this sharp distinction between spiritual and worldly activities, and integrating our spirituality in our everyday life so everything becomes part of our spiritual growth. I remember back, and I think it's something that happens just in society in general, because I remember back, I grew up in a working class family, in a working class environment in Denmark, in a factory town where most people had a factory job, and some people worked in the same factory for 40 years. And I remember the attitude in general was, work is just something you have to do. So you go to work, you do what you have to do, but all the time you're longing to be off so you can have free time. So there was a sharp delineation between free time and work. And work was unpleasant. It was just something you had to do. And I think that is what's breaking down more and more for many people. Now there's another side of that, is that people are never off of work, especially because we have these little tyrants in our pockets with a screen, we have to sit there and peck on all day. But so I'm not saying it's ideal, but I'm just saying these, the delineation between work and free time is being blurred because many people have more creative, more fulfilling jobs. But it's the same thing with spirituality. Why should we look at this is a spiritual activity and buying groceries is not a spiritual activity? Why can't we break down that barrier and find an entirely new approach to spirituality and an entirely new approach to practical living? I believe that's what we are meant to achieve in the Aquarian age. And I also believe that that is how spirituality is going to become more mainstream. I mean, I look back at both my first spiritual movement, the meditation movement, and my second one, and there was this dream that one day all people will be spiritual. And there was, of course, this very sectarian dream of one day they'll all recognize our movement as the only real spiritual movement. And I see that many other spiritual movements have the same thing. And it's just not realistic. It's just not realistic. That's not what we are meant to do in Aquarius. If it's again this, if you think that your form of spirituality is the only right one, and that it's your responsibility to convert the rest of the world to your form of spirituality, you're again putting a strain on yourself. How are you ever going to be fulfilled? Because is it likely in your lifetime that the rest of the world is going to be converted to follow your guru? Is that realistic? I look back at these two movements I was in and I can see it was completely unrealistic to think that this would ever be mainstream. But on the other hand, you see that, for example, when I was young, yoga was a new thing, and most people looked at it with great suspicion. But what has happened with yoga has become much more accepted. Now, mindfulness, I remember the Maharishi who started the TM movement. It was called Transcendental Meditation. And he once said that if he had known what the reaction to the name would be in the West, he would have named it something different. And I first thought that he was referring to the word transcendental, but no, he was referring to the word meditation, because at that time, so many people in the West had this negative reaction to meditation, partly because it was Eastern and it was foreign and this and that, but it was just a hostile reaction to meditation. But now look what's happened with mindfulness. It's also becoming mainstream. So what I'm saying is that spirituality, I believe it is going to become more and more mainstream in the Aquarian age. But it's not going to happen with one movement or one spiritual practice. It's going to happen with these very universal ideas that people can use for something in their practical life. I mean, most people who do mindfulness, they're not dreaming of going off to India and living in some ashram with some guru. They're just using it as a way to relax in their everyday life. And that's how spirituality is gradually going to become integrated in mainstream society. And if we can just make that shift, we can again take some stress off ourselves. And I believe actually we can do more good to help raise the consciousness of the planet. But in this video, I'm more focused on how can we avoid that the spiritual path becomes a stress factor that puts us in this straitjacket where we can't move and gives us such an unbalanced lifestyle that for many people it leads to burnout. How can we avoid that dysfunctional dynamic? Because I've seen it with people, that they are so focused on following this guru or this organization for a long time, and then they get to a point where they just can't handle it anymore. And unfortunately, here's a very, very toxic dynamic that comes in. And I can recognize it in myself. So here I am. I find this Summit Lighthouse Ascended Master movement. And the culture in that movement was, we have the highest spiritual teaching on the planet, which means we are the most spiritually advanced people on the planet. And so by going into the movement, by following all of these outer rules, you gained a certain status, especially compared to people who weren't in the movement. And this is a dynamic I've talked a little bit about before. As spiritual people, we grow up feeling like we're outsiders because we don't fit in the religious camp, we don't fit in the materialist camp. So we feel we're outsiders. Now we find the spiritual movement, now we're suddenly insiders, and we gain a status. So in our minds, we build this status, or rather, what is it that builds this status that we are special because we're in this movement? It's our egos. And I have a whole series of talks about ego and what it does. And so we come into the spiritual movement and our egos grasp at this and say, right, now I'm really special because I'm in this movement, I'm doing all of these outer things just right. I'm doing all the right things. I'm not driving a black car or wearing an orange t-shirt. So therefore, I'm one of the good people. But now comes the stress and it builds up. And in the beginning, we are denying that there's stress. And this is a typical, if you just look at stress research, what leads to problems is that people under stress, they don't recognize it. They deny it. They keep doing the same thing until they burn out. And why can't we recognize that we're under stress? Because you are in this wonderful spiritual movement. You're not supposed to be under stress. It's supposed to be so wonderful to do all of these things, even though you can't do them all in 24 hours. And so, but more than that, you see what I'm saying? Your ego has now built this status. You are so special because you are in the spiritual movement. So if you come to a point where you can't do it anymore, you can't handle the stress anymore, and you're considering, what can I do? It's almost like it becomes an all or nothing. You can't be in the movement without doing all the right things. So you think your only option is to leave. But leaving means what? It means now you are losing this special status because now you're not one of the good guys anymore who are saving the planet. And so again, people delay, people deny the stress, and that means what? The tension keeps building until they come to this point where now they can't handle this anymore and they have a breakdown and they have to leave. And what does this often lead to? Well, the ego has to explain why you have to leave. And it can't be the ego's fault. It can't be that you actually put yourself under stress, that you actually wanted to build this status of being so special that caused you to deny that you were having problems. It can't be you. So what does it have to be? Oh, it has to be the movement. It has to be the guru. And I've seen this in so many spiritual people, First, they are totally loyal and supportive to the guru and the organization. But then they come to this breakdown point, and now their egos have to, as an excuse for leaving, it's actually not a breakdown that they're leaving. It's not because they couldn't handle it and they couldn't live up to the demands. No, it's because it was wrong to begin with. There was something wrong with the movement. There was something wrong with the guru. Or the guru has changed. The guru was okay when they came into the movement, but now the guru has changed, and now there's something wrong. And therefore, the ego can sort of save face. I am leaving because I'm actually now more advanced than the people who are staying. I've seen many people do this. I've seen so many people do this. They were advanced when they were in the moving and doing everything right. But now they're leaving because they are more advanced than those who stay in the movement. And of course, the people who stay in the movement, they're looking at people leaving saying, oh, he wasn't a good enough Chela. He wasn't a good enough student. He was not dedicated enough. And all I'm saying is, this is what leads to disappointment. And if we could just become aware of that dynamic and use these tools I've talked about, with the ego, with the separate selves, and realize this is just a separate self. And the real goal of the spiritual path is to overcome these kind of separate selves, these kind of reactionary patterns. So we don't have a reaction to this. For example, why was I so eager to do everything right on the outer? Because I had a separate self that said, you need to be special. You need to be one of the really spiritual people. And they had another separate self that says, and you achieve this by following all the rules and doing everything right. And then I had a third separate self when I started feeling like maybe this is too much, that was, no, it's not too much. You don't need to push that aside. You just need to keep focused on the goal. You just need to keep going. You need to keep doing the same thing. And one day you will achieve different results. You will be at peace, you will be enlightened, you will have this breakthrough, all this stuff. So, you see what I'm saying? It's like we are almost set up to fail. Partly by this long spiritual tradition, partly by our modern societies. But really what we are set up to fail by is our own psychology. Because I look back at this and I see people who, as I said, flipped. First they were praising the guru, being loyal to the guru, then they were blaming the guru for everything that went wrong in their lives. It's essentially the same as some people do with their parents, And I have, for better or worse, I've avoided that reaction. And I can't really say why other than I've always realized that everything in my life is up to me, in my mind. How I react to life is a reaction inside my mind. And that I do have the potential to change my reactions, so I'm not so extreme. And I don't want to be insensitive, but I see the people who flip, from total loyalty to total criticism. And it really is because they haven't taken responsibility for this one thing. That my reaction, both when I was positive to the guru and when I'm now negative to the guru, it's all created in my own mind. And it is that reaction that puts me in a straitjacket. It wasn't the guru. It wasn't the outer organization. Now again, as I've said before about false teachers, there are, of course, spiritual movements that are clearly abusive. But even so, why were you attracted to it? Why did you put up with it? Why did you stay in it as long as you did? Because of something in your psychology. And why were you attracted to the spiritual path in the first place? Because behind your psychology, you have this higher desire to grow and reach a higher level of consciousness. And how are you going to reach a higher level of consciousness? By resolving the psychology that keeps you trapped in a lower state of consciousness. So what I'm saying is, if you find yourself in this dynamic now, or if you can see you've gone through it, switch your mind a little bit and say, okay, this wasn't something that was forced upon me from without. This was actually something I put in my life plan that I wanted to go through. Why? Because I want to resolve that psychology, so I can be free of it, and so I can get on with the creative aspect of my life plan, what I'm here to do. So look at it as an opportunity. Even if it's something that happened years ago, you can always go back. You never lose the opportunity. Go back look at the psychology and say, okay, what was that separate self that caused me to do this? Both to go into the movement and force myself to fit into the straitjacket, and what caused me to react the way I did when I left. And what can I learn from it? What do I need to see? What's the illusion behind it all? And I think a big part of this is really, I mean, there can be specific things for you personally, but a big part of it is we are actually an embodiment right now as spiritual people to help humankind get over this enigma, this riddle, this initiation of solving the contradiction between spiritual and worldly activities. And isn't that what caused all the stress? Isn't that what caused your reaction? And couldn't you just look at this psychology and learn from it, and then when you work through it, you will have a totally different approach to spirituality. And this might actually empower you to help other people who are going through this stuff and who are still struggling like you were struggling. And why do they have to struggle the same way if they can learn a little bit from you? So we can all become, examples that you can actually find a balanced approach to spirituality. A balanced lifestyle where you have your spiritual beliefs, you have certain spiritual activities you're doing, but your everyday activities are part of your spiritual lifestyle. I think that's a great goal to achieve. I can also see that it's a lot easier for me to achieve now that my children are grown-ups and I don't have small children. So I'm not saying it's necessarily easy. I understand, especially when you have small children, it is really an enormous dedication. But I just hope that maybe I can help you overcome this state of being pulled in two directions. That ends, because what Dylan was saying in the interview I started talking about is that he sees it in himself, he sees it in many of these younger people who have children, that they just want to get away from it all. It's too much. It becomes too overwhelming for them, not only with their own situation, but also what happens in the world. And they're dreaming about moving somewhere else to some better place. And I really think that's a pity for many people, because if everybody moves away from society, who's going to help take society forward? If all the aware people move. So anyway, I hope this maybe can help some people avoid the pitfalls that I was in for a long time. And I have to say that after I rethought my approach to spirituality and overcame this sense of the animosity between spiritual and physical activities, my life has become a lot more peaceful. I have a lot more peace of mind because I'm not pulled in opposite directions anymore the same way I was even 5 years ago or 10 years ago. But especially when I look back 30 or 40 years ago, how I was so obsessive compulsive. I had OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, about the spiritual path. And I think it's just normal as you progress and mature that you overcome that. You can still be spiritual, you're just not obsessive compulsive about it. And it's a much more peaceful place to be than what I was in those years or decades ago.